This story took place last year around the time that I moved into my new house. I remember being more excited than I normally was for the move, considering I had only lived in apartments before. When the day finally came for me to settle in, I remember my block throwing a small welcome party, and though it wasn't the biggest or most extravagant party, it made me feel welcomed and comfortable around these people. Throughout the day, I would get to know every one of my neighbors, that was except for the neighbors directly to the left of me. I was told that a man lived there by the name of Dave. Dave had been recently divorced, and after losing his kids in the court battle, he hadn't been the same. I felt awful after hearing the news, but it made me understand why he wasn't there. Later that night, after getting home and settling in my new house, I remember hearing a knock on my door. I opened the door to see a middle-aged man with a sunken face. Hey, I'm Dave. Sorry I couldn't make it to the party, but I'm your neighbor. Welcome to the neighborhood, and if you ever need anything, let me know. I remember him saying, before walking off rather quickly after I responded. Though it was a short conversation, I remember feeling grateful for his attempt at a connection. The neighborhood was a truly special one, and I was very happy with my choice. These are the thoughts that were filling my head as I began to fall asleep. Then I heard something that woke me up instantly. Very distantly, I heard the scream of a woman from what sounded like Dave's house. Feeling confused, I decided to check it out, as it wasn't that late, and maybe Dave could tell me if he heard it as well. After getting dressed, I made my way towards Dave's door and began to knock. It took what felt like a couple minutes for Dave to answer the door. This felt a bit strange, but upon greeting me, he told me that he was in bed, and it made a lot more sense. Hey, I don't mean to bother you, but did you happen to hear a noise? Sounded like a woman screaming, I said. As soon as Dave heard what I said, I saw this look gloss over his eyes. It's hard to describe, but as soon as it appeared, it was gone, and he was back to looking intrigued and concerned. No, I haven't heard anything about it, but if I do, I'll be the first to let you know, he said with a smile. It was at this moment that out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something. There was a door on the side of his hallway, and from under it I saw fingers reaching out as if to alert me. Somehow through it all, I kept a straight face despite feeling a pit in my stomach as I began to internally freak out. You alright? I remember him saying as he made a glance back, thankfully missing the outstretched fingers. Yeah, it must have been in my head. Thanks a lot, I tried to say as normally as possible as I made my way back home. As soon as I made it in, I phoned the police to tell them what I saw. They were there in less than 5 minutes. I felt guilty for some reason. Dave seemed like a nice guy, and if it was nothing, I've definitely solidified my place in the neighborhood as the weirdo. But if it was something, I had to act. As the minutes passed, I was on my guard looking over at Dave's house. Some of the neighbors also had made their way out. And Karen, a young woman from the block party, was talking to me as I filled her in on what happened. She agreed that it was weird and that it's worth checking out. Then the police came out. Dave was turned around in handcuffs and was being walked towards the car. Then out came a woman, also middle-aged, as well as 3 children. Karen let out a gasp, and she informed me that that was his wife and kids. This man had locked up his family after losing them in court. I couldn't believe it. It's been a few weeks now, and the family is completely moved. Dave is in prison, but I still think sometimes about how things could have turned out had I not heard the scream or seen those fingers. I'm telling this story to warn you about the dangers of being too trusting. The year was 2015, and we had just gotten a new set of neighbors. The weird part was that the house they were moving into had been vacant for over a decade now. The windows were falling in and vines lined the decrepit old house. Nevertheless, they claimed to be renovators who liked the neighborhood, which was weird admittedly because this wasn't the best neighborhood. They introduced themselves to the neighbors one by one, going door to door. This should have been another red flag, as almost no one did this where I was from. I remember the men asking if they could come in for a drink before heading over to the next house, and being the semi-kind person I am, I agreed to let them in. They got their drink and we talked a bit as one of the men asked to use the bathroom. At this point, I began to get cautious, but I told the man that it was the first door on the left. You see, I could see the door, and despite it sounding like these men were obviously up to bad things through the story, I did not get weird feelings from them at the moment. After the man got back from the bathroom, they both said goodbye and left to set out for the next house. I didn't think much of this incident as the day progressed. Eventually I made my way back to bed before going to sleep for the night. Falling asleep was no problem as I had very poor sleep the night before. After being asleep for a few hours, I awoke to the sound of a noise. It sounded like a window was being opened. I listened closely to the sounds, trying to see if one, they were real, and two, if they were coming from my house. Sure enough, I heard the continued sounds. Now it was footsteps coming from my downstairs hallway. I quickly sounded the silent alarm system in my house to notify the police and grabbed the weapon that I kept on the side of my bed. I then began creeping my way downstairs as before I could see anything, a shot rang out and just missed my legs. I ran backwards, firing wildly, hoping to scare the men off. As soon as I made it back upstairs, I sounded the actual alarm, which turned on, blaring throughout the house. That's when I heard the men jump back outside of the window directly below my room. I looked out at the yard to see the men from earlier dressed in all black running away. There was no doubt in my mind that it was them, as they had the same disparity in height and wore the same shoes they had entered with. By the time the cops had arrived, the men were long gone, and I gave over the footage of the men that was captured through my cameras. After confirming everything was okay, the police left after offering to station a unit nearby. I told them that it wouldn't be necessary, and I made my way back upstairs. The men never came back, as they were caught a few hours later. I hope that this story serves as a warning to all of you out there. Do not trust individuals whom you haven't known for a while. I regret letting them into my house, as I now know that these men were casing it out. And had I not had security systems and a weapon of my own, I might not be here to this day. Those men came fully equipped with weapons and were ready to fire in an instant. This incident took place last December. Christmas was just around the corner and everyone's spirits were high. That was except for Linda and John. You see, they were our next-door neighbors, and when we moved in, they were the leaders of the block. They were your typical quote-unquote perfect family. They had a nice house, a clean yard, and successful children. And because of this, everyone took notice when things started to fall apart. Their last child that was living with them moved out abruptly at the age of 16, and they stopped hosting any kind of block parties. Linda was rarely seen outside of her house, and John, aside from leaving to and from work, was just as absent. Though they always got slightly on my nerves, it definitely didn't feel good to see them fall so far from grace. Things got really serious, though, the night of December 20th, where I will take you now. It was a typical Tuesday night, and the wife and I were sitting at home watching Christmas movies, gearing up for our trip the next day with family. That was when all of a sudden we saw something. Linda was running through our front yard, looking over her shoulder as if someone was out for her. She ran towards our door, beating on it and asking for help. My wife ran to the door, let her in, and closed it, making sure to lock it. "What's going on, Linda?" I remember asking as I saw her covered in fresh bruises and blood. Her clothes were ripped and her hair disheveled. "It's John. He's crazy. He's been awful lately, but tonight he told me he was going to kill me. Call the cops, please." Before she even had to say anything, though, my wife was on the phone with the dispatcher. And that's when we saw him. John was walking around outside with something behind his back. He started to make his way towards our door, and that's when he knocked. "What do I do?" I whispered frantically. "Just act normal," my wife told me as she answered the door. "Hey, John, what's up?" she said as I walked alongside her. "Oh, nothing much, guys." "You wouldn't have happened to see Linda, would you?" "No, why? What's going on?" I said, trying to remain as calm as possible. He looked up and down at me as if peering into my soul, trying to spot any sign of a lie. Nothing, thanks, guys. Have a good one," he said as he began to walk off. We shut the door, and that's when through the window I noticed what was behind his back. He had a small hatchet that he was trying to shiftily hide from sight. My wife ran over to Linda to embrace and comfort her. A couple minutes later, the police arrived, but by that moment John had caught on and was gone. It turned out that John's business had been beginning to fail over the past few months. This led him to become abusive not only to his wife, but his own son, causing him to move in with his grandmother. That night in question, John was forced to face the reality that his business was doomed for failure. Instead of owning up to it, though, he turned on his wife, beating her senseless before she finally escaped when he went to the back for a weapon. Let this be a lesson to everyone to understand that even the most seemingly perfect people can have dark lives. I'm so glad we were able to help Linda, and I'm so glad that he didn't catch on, because had we, I don't think we could have defended ourselves against a man with a hatchet.